My name is Gabriella Hayes. I'm 35 years old, and about 3 months ago, I ended my engagement in the middle of my own kitchen, without raising my voice once. Not because of a fight, not because of betrayal in the way people expect, but because of one sentence. He said it like it made perfect sense, like it was logical, like I would naturally agree. I want a real wedding. If it doesn't feel high end, then what's the point? That was the moment everything became simple. I work as a refrigeration technician for a regional cold storage company in Eindhoven. Most of my week is spent driving between warehouses and supermarkets fixing industrial cooling units. Compressors fail. Systems overheat. When something breaks, it doesn't wait. It becomes a problem immediately. So I learned early on to stay organized, stay prepared, and most importantly, never ignore reality. I built my life the same way. I own a 3-bedroom house that I bought 5 years before I met Adrian. Nothing flashy, just stable, a place where everything makes sense because I made it that way. Adrian Cole is 32. We had been together a little over 3 years, engaged for 8 months when everything started to fall apart. At the beginning, Adrian came across as confident, sharp, the kind of man who always seemed sure of himself. He had opinions about everything: restaurants, travel, clothes, furniture, even what brands of groceries were acceptable. At first, I thought it was just personality. Some people just like things a certain way. But over time, I started noticing the pattern. Anything modest, he called embarrassing. Anything practical, he called boring. And anything that didn't impress other people, he dismissed entirely. Still, money had never been a direct problem between us. He worked as a dental lab technician, making crowns and bridges for a private clinic network. The pay was solid. Between his income and mine, we lived comfortably. Not flashy, but stable. So when we started planning the wedding, I assumed we were approaching it the same way. Something meaningful, something grounded, something that made sense. The first meeting with the wedding planner proved me wrong. Adrian started talking about things that didn't sound like a wedding. They sounded like a production. Imported floral walls, designer dress budgets that made me pause, a multi-day event schedule for guests who had never asked for it, and one phrase he kept repeating over and over again: "It needs to feel high-end." At the time, I thought it was just inflated numbers. Planner talk. The kind of thing that gets adjusted once reality steps in. Then the estimate arrived in my email. Just under $180,000. I stared at the number for a full minute, convinced there had to be a mistake. That night, I printed it out and sat down with Adrian at the kitchen table. In my house. I explained calmly that there was absolutely no scenario where I was spending $180,000 on a wedding weekend. He barely looked at the paper. Then he leaned back in his chair and said something that shifted everything. If I wanted a cheap wedding, maybe I wouldn't marry you at all. I want to be clear about something. This was not about whether I could technically afford it. It was about what the number represented. The house still has a mortgage. I've been paying it down aggressively for years. I keep savings because the systems I work on don't fail politely. They fail fast and expensively. Spending $180,000 on a wedding wouldn't just be excessive. It would erase years of stability. So I explained all of that, calmly, clearly. I even offered a compromise, something around $40,000. Still a large wedding, still meaningful, still more than enough. Adrian laughed. Not softly, not kindly. The kind of laugh people use when they think you've embarrassed yourself. Then he said something that made everything very simple. I'd rather have no wedding than something small. That was it. That was the moment the conversation ended. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just sat there for a few seconds, thinking about what he had actually said. Because if marriage only happens under certain conditions, then it's not about the marriage. It's about the condition. So I nodded once and said, "All right." He looked confused, like he was waiting for me to continue negotiating. Instead, I told him the truth. If the only wedding he was willing to have cost $180,000, then there would be no wedding. His expression froze. I explained it clearly. No deposits, no venues, no planners, nothing. The wedding was canceled. For a few seconds, he didn't react. Then everything hit at once. He started talking fast about financing options, loans, family contributions, even vendor sponsorships through connections he had. That part actually made the decision easier. I told him I wasn't taking loans for a wedding, and I wasn't turning our marriage into some kind of social media performance. Then I said the part that ended everything. Since there was no wedding, and the engagement was over, he needed to start packing his things. He stood up so fast the chair scraped across the floor. The reaction was immediate. Anger. Accusations. He said I was controlling him, punishing him, threatening him over money. I kept my voice steady. There was no punishment. He had just told me he would rather have no wedding than a smaller one. So we were having no wedding. which meant the engagement was over, which meant we needed to separate. Simple, logical, final. That made him even angrier. He started pacing the kitchen, saying I was bluffing, that I would calm down once I realized how ridiculous this would look. That word caught my attention. Look, not feel, not mean. Look. That was when I understood something clearly. This had never been about us. It had always been about how things appeared to other people. I repeated it one last time. The wedding was canceled. He needed to move out. He stared at me for a few seconds, waiting. For hesitation. For doubt. For anything. There was none. Something in his expression shifted. From disbelief to anger. He said I had just wasted 3 years of his life. Then he said something quieter. Colder. If you think you can humiliate me like this and walk away, you're wrong. I didn't respond. There was nowhere that conversation could go anymore. He grabbed his phone, his keys, his bag, and as he walked toward the door, he said I would regret this once people heard what I had done. Then he slammed the door hard enough that something rattled in the hallway. A few seconds later, I heard his car start. And then, silence. I stood there in the kitchen for a moment, just processing how quickly everything had ended. 3 years, 8 months engaged, gone in less than 20 minutes. My phone started buzzing about 10 minutes later. His name. Again. Calls. Messages. Stacking. I didn't open them. There was nothing left to explain. Nothing left to negotiate. After the 6th call, I blocked his number. Not out of anger, just because I was done. The house felt different after he left. Not empty, just quieter. The kind of quiet where you realize how much noise another person brings into a space without you noticing. I walked through the rooms. Everything was still in place, except for a few things he had grabbed on his way out. I sat down on the couch and started thinking about the practical side. 3 years means shared space, clothes, shoes, boxes, nothing complicated. But it still needed to be handled cleanly. My plan was simple. Give it a day or two, then arrange a time. Direct. Final. I went to bed early that night, not because I was tired, but because the decision itself had already taken everything out of me. And the strange part was, I didn't feel regret, just clarity. The next morning, I woke up to the same quiet house, made coffee, and went to work like I normally would. My job does not really allow for personal drama days. When a refrigeration system goes down in a storage facility full of frozen inventory, people expect you to show up and fix it. Compressors do not care that your relationship ended the night before. Freezer alarms do not pause because your future collapsed in your kitchen. So I kept moving. That morning started at a supermarket distribution center on the edge of the city. One of the industrial cooling units had been short cycling overnight, and the floor supervisor was already irritated by the time I got there. I spent the first hour crouched beside a panel with a flashlight between my teeth, tracing a problem that turned out to be a failing pressure control switch. It should have been routine, the kind of task I could do with half my brain. But every few minutes, I caught myself replaying his voice from the kitchen. I'd rather have no wedding than something small. The sentence had a strange aftertaste now. Not just arrogant, empty. Like once he said it out loud, all the decoration fell away and what was underneath finally showed itself. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed in the pocket of my work trousers. At first I ignored it, then it buzzed again, then again. When I finally checked it during a break, the name on the screen surprised me. Leon. I had met him exactly twice through Adrian at a dinner gathering months earlier. He was one of those social orbit people, friendly enough, present at events, never close enough to become part of my actual life. His message was simple. Hey, what the hell happened with you and Adrian last night? I stared at it for a second, then locked my phone and went back to work. 10 minutes later, another message came in. This time from one of Adrian's coworkers. Then another. Then another. Within half an hour, I had 5 separate messages from people connected to his side of life, asking some version of the same question. Some sounded curious, some sounded cautious. One sounded openly accusatory, like they already believed they knew the answer and were only contacting me to confirm whether I was as cold as they had heard. That was when I realized something important. Adrian had not just left angry, he had left broadcasting. He was already telling people a version of the story, and judging by the tone of those messages, it sounded very different from reality. At first, I tried to ignore it. People ask questions when they smell drama. Most of the time, they lose interest as quickly as they find it. I told myself it would burn out on its own, that by evening, everyone would move on to something else. But the messages kept coming. By lunchtime, Leon had stopped texting and started calling. I stepped outside the facility to answer because at that point, curiosity had pushed past annoyance. The air outside was cold enough to sting, and I remember standing beside the service van with one hand still greasy from machine oil when I picked up. He did not bother with small talk. What did you do to him? The phrasing caught my attention immediately. Not what happened. What did you do? I asked him what Adrian had said. Leon hesitated for half a second, which told me the answer before he even gave it. He's telling people you called off the wedding because you panicked about money and commitment, that after he'd spent months planning everything, you humiliated him and threw him out. I actually laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Months planning everything. That was almost impressive in a way. Not the lie itself, the speed. He had managed to reconstruct reality into something else before I'd even finished my first service call of the day. So I gave Leon the short version. The real version. Adrian demanded a wedding budget of 180,000 euros. I refused. I offered compromise. He said he would rather have no wedding than something smaller. So I canceled it. Then I told him to move out because the house is mine and the relationship was over. Leon went quiet. Not defensive, not argumentative, just quiet in the way people get when the story they were handed suddenly starts falling apart in their hands. Finally, he said, "That sounds very different from what he told everyone." "Yes," I said, "because it is." There was another pause, then a quieter question. "Did he really say he'd rather have no wedding?" "Yes." "And you stayed calm?" I didn't raise my voice once. That part seemed to matter to him more than I expected. Maybe because Adrian had been shaping the story around cruelty, around me being harsh, cold, unreasonable. And the problem with that version was that it depended on emotion, on spectacle, on me behaving like the villain he needed me to be. But I hadn't. I had just ended it. Cleanly. Leon let out a slow breath and said he needed to think. Then he hung up. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stood there for a moment beside the van, feeling something colder than anger settle into place. Because rumors are irritating. But deliberate distortion is something else. It meant he was not embarrassed by what happened. He was furious that he had lost control of the image. That afternoon, I kept working, but I noticed the distraction creeping in at the edges. I mislaid a socket wrench I had just been holding, read the same pressure gauge twice. Took longer than usual writing up a service summary because my brain kept circling back to the same question. How many people had he told already? And more importantly, what else was he saying? When I got home that evening, the house felt larger than it had the night before. Not lonelier, just stripped down, honest. The bathroom counter already looked less crowded. One side of the wardrobe sat half empty. In the spare room, a few boxes of his things still waited where he had left them months ago, after meaning to sort them later. I stood in the doorway for a minute, looking at them. 3 years really does leave traces. Not dramatic ones, usually. Just practical residue. Extra hangers. Chargers with no home. Shoes by the back door. A coffee mug you never liked but kept using because it was his favorite. I made dinner and ate standing at the counter because sitting at the table felt too deliberate somehow. Too much like recreating a scene I had already survived. Afterward, I opened my laptop and started writing out a short, neutral email in my head for later. A time for him to collect his things. Conditions. Clear boundaries. No discussion beyond logistics. Then my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. I ignored it. A message came through a few seconds later. You didn't have to humiliate him like that. I deleted it without replying. 2 minutes later, another. He loved you, you know. Then one more. People are saying you threw him out over one disagreement. That one I stared at for longer than the others. Not because it hurt, because of the wording. One disagreement. As if the argument had been about napkin colors or the guest list. As if demanding a 6-figure performance and making marriage conditional on it was just a minor difference in taste. That was what unsettled me most in those first 2 days. Not that Adrian lied, but how easily other people were willing to reduce the truth into something more comfortable, something simpler. A woman ending an engagement calmly over values and financial reality is less entertaining than a cruel fiancé with commitment issues. One version forces people to think. The other gives them a villain and lets them move on. So I put my phone face down on the counter and let the silence return. The next day followed the same pattern. Work, service calls, more messages. A few came from people I had never even met, which meant the story had already moved beyond his immediate circle. I did not respond to any of them. I had no interest in defending myself to people whose opinions had never built a single wall in my house or paid a single bill in my life. Still, by late afternoon, the constant noise had started to irritate me in a way that was less emotional and more clinical. Like a leak behind a wall, small at first, easy to dismiss, but persistent enough that you know it will spread if nobody shuts it off. Leon called again that evening. His voice sounded different this time, less certain, more careful. He said Adrian had been telling people I refused to invest in our future, which would have been laughable if it were not so obviously crafted to make me sound selfish. He also said Adrian kept emphasizing how cold I had been, how I had supposedly thrown him out like he meant nothing. I asked Leon one question. Did he mention the amount? A pause. No, of course not, because that was the detail that ruined everything for him. Without the number, he sounded heartbroken. With the number, he sounded absurd. Leon asked me if there was anything else he should know. There was something about the way he said it that told me he was trying to decide whether to keep standing in Adrian's corner, whether the version he'd been handed still made sense. So I told him exactly what happened at the kitchen table. The planner, the estimate, the imported floral walls, the designer budget, the laugh when I suggested 40,000, the sentence that ended it. I'd rather have no wedding than something small. Leon was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, almost to himself, he left that part out. Yes, I said again, he did. When we hung up, I did not feel vindicated, just tired. There is something exhausting about realizing a person you were prepared to marry would rather edit reality than face what he actually said. That night, I walked through the house again before bed, turning off lights one room at a time. In the hallway, the framed picture that had rattled when he slammed the door was slightly crooked. I reached up and straightened it. That tiny movement stayed with me for some reason. Maybe because it felt symbolic in the simplest way. One sharp impact, one quiet correction. By the third day, the messages slowed a little, not because the story had died, but because it had changed shape. Some people stopped contacting me altogether, which usually means they learned enough to feel embarrassed. A few sent oddly neutral texts, the kind people write when they suspect they backed the wrong version too early and want to retreat without admitting it. I left those unanswered too. There was no prize for explaining myself to spectators. And underneath all of it, another thought had started forming, faint at first, then sharper. If Adrian was willing to tell this many people a false story this quickly, how far was he willing to take it? That question followed me into the end of the week. Not as fear, just awareness, because I knew his pattern now. He cared about perception more than truth. And people like that rarely stop at embarrassment if they think a bigger performance might restore their control. At the time, I still thought the worst part had already happened. I thought the relationship was over. The wedding was canceled, and the remaining mess would be limited to gossip, a few awkward conversations, and a Saturday morning where he loaded boxes into a van and disappeared. I was wrong, because 2 days later, the situation stopped being social and turned professional. 2 days later, just after lunch, my supervisor called me into his office. The tone alone told me something was off. Not urgent, not angry, just controlled. The kind of tone people use when they're trying to stay neutral before they understand a situation. His name is Mark. He's not the type to waste time with unnecessary conversations. If he calls you in, there's a reason. When I stepped inside, he didn't gesture for me to sit right away. He just looked at me for a second longer than usual, like he was measuring something. Then he asked a question that didn't make sense at first. Do you know someone named Adrian Cole? I felt something shift internally. Not panic, not fear, just recognition. Yes, I said, he was my fiancé. Mark nodded once, then turned his monitor toward me. There's an email you should see. The sender name was Adrian. The recipient wasn't marked directly. It was the company's general operations inbox, which meant it had already passed through at least one set of eyes before landing here. I started reading. The first sentence was neutral enough. By the second paragraph, it wasn't. Adrian had written a detailed message describing me as aggressive, unstable, prone to intimidation during personal conflicts. He implied that I had threatened him during an argument and suggested that promoting someone like me into a supervisory role could create a hostile environment for other employees. I read the entire thing once, then again. Not because I didn't understand it, because I did, very clearly. Canceling the wedding hadn't been enough. He needed to regain control of the narrative. And when social perception wasn't enough, he escalated. For a few seconds, I didn't say anything. I just looked at the screen, noticing the structure of the message, the wording, the way he avoided specifics but leaned heavily on implication. It was carefully written, not emotional, which made it worse. Mark leaned back slightly and asked the obvious question. Do I need to be concerned about any of this? I turned the monitor back toward him and shook my head. No. Then I told him exactly what had happened. No dramatics, no exaggeration, just the facts. The wedding planning, the estimate, the €180,000 demand. my refusal, the conversation at the kitchen table, his statement about preferring no wedding over a smaller one, the cancellation, the request for him to move out. I kept my tone the same way I had kept it that night. Even, structured, clear. Mark didn't interrupt. He just listened, fingers folded on the desk. When I finished, he asked something practical. Do you still have messages from that night? Yes. Blocking Adrian had stopped the calls, but it hadn't erased what came before. I pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and handed it over. He scrolled in silence, and the contrast was immediate. There's a difference between someone describing themselves as a victim and someone's actual words. The messages weren't from someone afraid. They were from someone furious. Accusations, insults, a few threats, lines about how I would regret embarrassing him, how I had no idea who I was dealing with, how this wasn't over. Mark read through several of them, then handed the phone back without comment. He leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. This isn't the first time I've seen something like this, he said. That surprised me more than the email. Apparently, when promotions are involved, personal conflicts have a way of spilling into professional spaces. Angry partners, exes trying to interfere, people looking for leverage where they can find it. The difference is, those claims only work if there's something behind them. Mark asked if there had ever been any complaints about my behavior at work. There hadn't. No warnings. No disciplinary issues. Nothing. My record was clean. That mattered more than anything Adrian could write in an email. Mark turned the monitor back toward himself and closed the message. Then he said something that shifted the entire situation in a direction Adrian probably hadn't considered. When someone sends an accusation like this to a company, he said, it doesn't just affect the person they're targeting. It creates a record. I didn't respond. I already understood what he meant. That email wasn't just an attempt. It was documentation, permanent, traceable, and completely unsupported. Mark continued, if those claims aren't backed by anything, it can create problems for the person who sent them. There was no threat in his tone, just reality, the kind that doesn't need emphasis. He asked me one last time if there was anything else I wanted to add. I shook my head. No, because there wasn't. Everything that needed to be said was already sitting there, in my messages, in my work history, in the absence of anything resembling the behavior Adrian had described. Mark nodded once, then said we would proceed with the promotion review as planned. The email would be documented, my explanation noted, and the company would handle it internally. That was it. No escalation. No drama. Just process. I stood up, thanked him, and walked out of the office. Back into the hallway. Back into the same building I had walked into that morning before any of this existed. But something had changed. Not externally. Internally. Because that was the moment I understood the full shape of what Adrian had done. This wasn't emotional anymore. It wasn't about the wedding. It wasn't even about the breakup. He had made a decision to try to damage something real in my life, to repair something imaginary in his. And the problem with decisions like that is simple. Once you put them into writing, they stop being reversible. The rest of the day passed quietly, almost strangely so. No messages, no calls, like the noise from earlier in the week had suddenly hit a wall and gone still. That silence felt different from before, heavier, more deliberate. That evening, I sat on the couch with my phone in my hand, scrolling back through the earlier messages again. Not because I needed to, just to confirm something. Every line, every word, every reaction, none of it matched the version he had sent to my company. Not even close. And that gave me something I hadn't fully acknowledged yet. Not relief, certainty. Because truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to exist. And in this case, it did. 2 days later, I received another message from Leon. The tone was different, shorter, more direct. Did Adrian contact your company? I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. Yes. 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then stopped, then appeared again. Finally, the message came through. He's been telling people he did. That didn't surprise me. What surprised me was the next part. He thinks it helped. I leaned back against the couch, staring at that sentence. He thinks it helped. There was something almost surreal about it. Not just the action, but the belief behind it, that this would fix something, that this would restore control, that this would make him look better. I typed one response. It didn't. Leon didn't reply right away. And for the first time since all of this started, I felt something settle into place completely. Because Adrian had just crossed a line that doesn't depend on emotion anymore. A line where consequences stop being optional and start becoming inevitable. At that point, I still didn't know exactly how that would unfold. But I knew one thing clearly. This wasn't going to end the way he expected. About 4 days after that conversation with Mark, I received another message from Leon. The timing alone told me something had shifted. Up until then, everything had been noise, questions, speculation, fragments of a story moving through people who weren't directly involved. But this message was different, short, direct, no curiosity in it. Hey, is it true Adrian contacted your company officially? I read it once, then replied, yes. The response came almost immediately. He's been telling people about it like it was some kind of win. I leaned back slightly in my chair, staring at the screen. That part didn't surprise me. It fit the pattern perfectly. For Adrian, perception wasn't just important, it was everything. If he could frame something as a victory, then in his mind it became one. It didn't matter whether it was true. It mattered whether people believed it. What exactly is he saying? I asked. Leon's reply came in pieces. He's telling people he stood up to you, that you were unstable, that he made sure your company knew before they put you in charge of anyone. I let out a slow breath. So that was the narrative. Not just defending himself anymore, rewriting the entire situation into something heroic. I didn't respond right away, because there was something else happening underneath that story, something quieter, but far more important. Information moves differently inside workplaces, especially structured ones. And Adrian worked inside a corporate dental clinic network, not a small private office, a system, departments, management layers, HR. And stories like that don't stay contained. Leon sent another message before I could respond. There's more. That was when I sat up. What? He told someone at work, not just friends, actual colleagues. That was the moment the situation shifted again. Because telling friends a distorted story is one thing. Telling coworkers, in a corporate environment, about sending a formal accusation to another company, that's something else entirely. Do they know what he sent? I asked. I think so, Leon replied. He showed at least one person. Said he was proud of it. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. Not because I was shocked, because I could already see where this was going. Actions don't exist in isolation, especially not written ones, especially not ones sent to official company channels. They're going to look into it, Leon added. I nodded to myself, even though he couldn't see it. Of course they are. From their perspective, this wasn't just personal anymore. One of their employees had contacted an external company and made serious claims about someone's behavior. That creates risk. Legal risk. Reputational risk. And companies don't ignore risk. They investigate it. What happens now? Leon asked. I thought about that for a moment. Now, I said, now it becomes their problem. That was the last message I sent him that day. Because from that point on, the situation wasn't in Adrian's control anymore. And it wasn't in mine either. It had moved into something else. Process. Policy. Documentation. The kind of system that doesn't respond to emotion. Only to evidence. 2 days later, Leon called instead of texting. His voice sounded different. Less curious. More certain. They called him in, he said. I didn't ask who. I already knew. HR. They asked him directly if he sent the email. And? I asked. He said yes. Of course he did. That was the thing about Adrian. He didn't see the email as a mistake. He saw it as a move. A calculated one. And then? I asked. Leon exhaled slowly. They asked if there was any report. Police. Legal complaint. Anything official behind what he wrote. I already knew the answer. There wasn't, Leon confirmed. The silence that followed carried more weight than anything else he could have said. Because at that point, the situation becomes very simple. A formal accusation. No evidence. No record. No supporting documentation. Just a personal conflict. Turned into a written claim sent to another company. What happened after that? I asked. Leon hesitated. Not because he didn't know. Because he did. And he knew what it meant. The meeting didn't last long, he said finally. I didn't interrupt. He thought he was going to get a warning, Leon continued. Maybe a conversation about keeping personal matters separate. I almost closed my eyes at that. Because that assumption alone explained everything. Adrian didn't understand the difference between personal drama and corporate liability. He didn't get a warning, Leon said. I stayed quiet. They let him go. Just like that. No escalation. No drawn-out process. Just a decision. Clean. Final. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Because there wasn't much to add. The outcome made sense. Not emotionally. Structurally. Companies don't protect employees who create unnecessary risk. And sending unverified accusations to another organization, that's not just risky. It's reckless. What is he saying now? I asked after a moment. Leon let out a short breath. Nothing, really. That was telling. When something backfires that hard, Leon added, people stop talking about it. Of course they do. Because the story had flipped. What started as a performance had turned into consequence. He didn't expect it, Leon said. No, I replied quietly. He didn't. Because people who rely on perception rarely think about systems. They think in reactions, in impressions. in how things look in the moment. But systems don't care about moments. They care about records. And Adrian had created one, a written one, with his own name attached to it. After the call ended, I sat there for a while, letting the silence settle again. The house felt the same, steady, unchanged. And that contrast stayed with me, because somewhere else, his life had just shifted completely. Not because of me, not because of the breakup, but because of a decision he made after it, to turn something personal into something professional, and lose control of it in the process. The next Monday, Mark called me into his office again. This time, his expression was different, lighter. Good news, he said. The promotion. Supervisory role. Maintenance scheduling across multiple sites. Less emergency fieldwork. More structure. More responsibility. More stability. I nodded once, taking it in. Not as a victory, just as confirmation. That nothing Adrian had tried had actually worked. If anything, it had clarified everything. That same week, I heard through Leon that the situation on Adrian's side had started spreading. Not dramatically, not loudly, just steadily. Because once people start asking the right questions, stories change. Why did you contact her employer? Was there any actual report? Any proof? And when the answers to those questions came back empty, the narrative collapsed. What he had framed as standing up for himself started to look like something else. A reaction. A reckless one. And the problem with those is simple. They don't just fail, they expose. By the end of that week, the noise had almost completely disappeared. No more messages, no more questions, just quiet. The kind that comes after everything has already been decided. And for the first time since that night in the kitchen, everything felt fully settled. Not because the situation had resolved itself emotionally, but because it had resolved itself structurally. And those kinds of endings don't reopen. About 2 weeks after everything fell apart, I realized there was only one thing left unfinished. His belongings. 3 years together doesn't disappear cleanly. It leaves behind practical things. Clothes in the wardrobe, shoes by the door, boxes in the spare room that were never fully unpacked because there was always time later. Later had just run out. Up until that point, I hadn't heard from Adrian directly since the night he slammed the door and drove off. Blocking his number had kept things quiet, and after everything that followed, I assumed that silence would hold. But separation still requires a final step. So instead of unblocking him, I sent a short email. Simple, neutral, no emotion. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. I would be home. He could collect the rest of his things. It would be quick. He replied a few hours later. Agreed. Nothing else. Saturday came without tension. No anticipation, no anxiety, just structure. At exactly 10, a small rental van pulled up outside the house. I watched it through the front window for a moment before opening the door. Adrian stepped out first. He wasn't alone. One of his friends was with him, someone I recognized vaguely from a dinner months ago. They didn't say anything as they approached. No greeting, no attempt at conversation. Just purpose. When Adrian stepped inside, the difference in him was immediate. No anger, no performance, no raised voice. Just quiet, focused. Like everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks had stripped something away. We didn't stand in the doorway or revisit anything. There was no moment where either of us tried to reopen the conversation. That part of the story had already ended. He moved through the house methodically. Bedroom, closet, bathroom, spare room, collecting what was his and ignoring everything else. His friend followed behind, carrying boxes out to the van. The entire process was efficient. 40 minutes. No wasted movement. No unnecessary words. At one point, Adrian paused in the living room. Just for a few seconds. He looked around. Not dramatically. Not like he was trying to make a point. Just observing. The couch. The hallway. The kitchen beyond it. I couldn't tell exactly what he was thinking. But there was something in the stillness of that moment that felt different from the man who had stood in that same space 2 weeks earlier, demanding something that never made sense. Then he moved again. Back to the task. The last box went out the door a few minutes later. He stood near the entrance for a moment, like he was deciding whether to say something or leave it as it was. Then he spoke. I didn't think it would end like this. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. Not defensive. Not angry. Just flat. I considered that for a second. Neither did I said. That was the only honest answer. Because 3 weeks earlier, we had been planning a wedding. And now we were dividing belongings in silence. He nodded once. No argument. No attempt to reshape the narrative. Just acceptance. Then he turned, walked out the door, and got into the van. A minute later, it pulled away from the curb. And that was it. No second conversation. No final confrontation. No dramatic ending. Just absence. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet settle back into the house. It felt different now. Not empty. Complete. I walked through each room slowly, noticing the small changes. The extra space in the closet, the cleared shelf in the bathroom, the spare room finally looking like a room again, instead of a storage space waiting to be sorted. Everything had reset, not to what it was before him, but to something clearer, more intentional. I went into the kitchen and stopped near the table where everything had ended. Same surface, same chairs, but a completely different reality. And that was when the full weight of it finally settled into something simple. The decision that ended everything was never complicated. It just felt that way in the moment, because it came wrapped in emotion, history, time. But underneath all of that, it was one clear line. He wanted something that didn't make sense, and he made the relationship conditional on it. Everything that followed, the arguments, the rumors, the email, the fallout, came after that line had already been crossed. Canceling the wedding didn't end the relationship. It revealed it. A few days later, I finalized the last of the small details, changed a few accounts, removed his access where it still existed, closed the remaining loops. Clean, direct, finished. Work settled into its new rhythm not long after. The promotion came with more responsibility, but also more structure. Fewer emergency drives in the middle of the night, more oversight, more planning, more stability. The kind I had been building toward long before Adrian ever walked into my life. I didn't celebrate what happened to him. Losing a job isn't something I would wish on anyone. But I also didn't feel responsible for it, because that outcome didn't come from the breakup. It came from what he chose to do after it. From the moment he decided to turn something personal into something that could be documented. And once it was documented, it stopped being a story he could control. I heard a few small updates through Leon over the following weeks. Nothing dramatic. Just fragments. Adrian trying to explain what happened. Some people distancing themselves. Others asking questions he couldn't answer cleanly. The kind of quiet fallout that doesn't explode, but lingers. Then eventually, even that stopped. People move on. Stories fade. And the ones that don't hold up under scrutiny tend to disappear the fastest. Looking back now, the strangest part is how quickly everything changed. 3 years together. 8 months engaged. And the final decision. Less than 20 minutes. But that's the thing about clarity. It doesn't always arrive slowly. Sometimes it shows up in a single sentence. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. I'd rather have no wedding than something small. He meant it. And because he meant it, everything else became inevitable. The wedding never happened. The relationship ended. He lost the job he had built over years. And my life moved forward into something that feels quieter, more stable, more honest. Not because I won anything, but because I stopped negotiating with something that didn't make sense. And once you do that, everything else tends to fall into place on its own.